Hello everybody and good afternoon. So my name's Humera SULTAN. I'm a public health consultant in Birmingham City Council in England, which is the second largest city in England after London. And there I work as a public health consultant in our local authority. But I'm taking a bit of a break from my day job and actually doing a PhD. And my PhD is all about how can we help local authorities to maximise their value from parks. Okay, so I'm conscious we've got quite an international audience, and not everybody will know how local authorities work in the UK. So I'll try and do that in about 30 seconds. And I'll talk a little bit about the issues with funding. I'm not going to make the case that parks are important. Everybody here at this symposium is here because they know parks are important. But I want to talk to you a little bit about environmental justice as well, from an equity perspective. And one thing that I think has been a recurrent theme is about getting people to use parks. It's really about making sure that they're good quality. And if that's to happen, they have to be invested in. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight, which is at the start of my PhD, into actually how do we understand how the budgets work in terms of one local authority in England. We'll look at how that budget has changed with time and by specific park characteristics. And I'm not sure I'll get to the end of my presentation, but if we do, we'll have hopefully a bit of a conversation about how do we measure quality in parks. Okay, so my journey into parks has not been usual at all. I've never actually worked in a park. I probably couldn't tell you what different kind of trees are or plants, but I think I've learned quite a lot in the last day and a half. But I started off by doing a Master's in Public Health back in 2009. I know you're all thinking, gosh, you look 21, so how is that possible? But it's a lie. And then I've spent quite a long period of time doing public health training. I qualified as a consultant in public health in 2014, and then I've had a number of public health consultant roles, but my last public health consultant role was actually in Birmingham, which is where I live, it's where I've grown up, and the role was all about parks, and how do we get our local authority to take parks seriously and recognise how important they are. I fell in love with parks at this point, and I decided to kind of really invest my time in them, and I undertook some fellowships, and one of them now is basically allowing me to do a PhD. Parks feature heavily in my life outside of work and in work as well. So my husband and I, that's him over there with our little boy Isa, we set up a local Friends of Park volunteer group in my local park. We did lots of cool stuff like setting up forest schools and getting kids to paint stones. I couldn't ride a bike 6 years ago, and my colleague David is in the audience, who's helped me with this piece of work. And I'm also now, but because I learned to ride my bike in parks, I'm now a triathlete and do 100-mile rides around the country. So I'm very, very grateful for my local park. And my biggest achievement, I think, in my role as a public health consultant is coming up with this, our Future Nature City Plan, which is all about essentially how Birmingham is going to start its journey in terms of prioritising nature and making the changes that need to happen. So, funding parks in the UK. So local authorities in the UK are responsible for a number of services. I'm not going to read them all out, but there's a lot of them, and parks is just one of them. And that's why we have this issue about budgets and about choices and about allocating resources. So the way in which budgets flow into parks, in England at least, or in the UK, we get a grant from central government. That's the main way in which money flows in. And then a local authority gets that budget, and it has to kind of divide it up into these areas called directorates. And generally, we kind of have frontline services like waste management. We also have like leisure services, environmental health. These are generally what we term city operations services, and parks get lumped into that usually. So not only are we up against things like social care, which are funding children and adults, but parks are up against other things like waste management. I think probably every part of the world, getting your bins collected is something that people get quite passionate about. And if that service is threatened, often parks get less and less of a look in. So how has parks funding changed in the UK? Well, we all know here that parks are really important for health and well-being, but we know that parks need funding to be maintained to a good standard if we want people to use them. But in the UK, our parks have lost nearly £700 million over a 10-year period. So we've got some parks that kind of look like this, which is Moonlit Park in Birmingham, but there's lots and lots of parks that look like this now. You can't really even see the name of that park because the sign is so dirty. It's called Sarah Park, and that's also in Birmingham. There's this issue of environmental justice, essentially around this whole notion that everybody deserves to have access to good quality space wherever you live, but that's not happening. So I promised Tim I'd mention heat islands. So we did a piece of work, and I published this as part of my pre-doc fellowship. We decided to look at Birmingham. This is a map of Birmingham. We have 69 wards or areas in the city. And we decided to look at each area of the city and say, right, what does it look like for urban heat? What does it look like from a flood risk perspective? Amount of green space that it has? What does it look like in terms of a really important public health measure, which is excess years life lost, and also deprivation? And we put that into an index, added it all up, and came out with these scores here. Now, basically, if it's red, it's not very good. And green shows there's better levels of environmental justice. And what this map showed us really clearly was we need to be really prioritising those areas in red. Those places haven't got enough green space, and where they do have green space, the quality isn't good enough. They are roasting hot in the summer, not enough trees. So we said, right, we took this and took this to our cabinet. They are the elected members who make decisions about how the council spends its money, and said, we need to start taking this seriously. And they agreed that we could create the City of Nature plan to be able to prioritise those areas. So we got given some extra money. That was from a fund. I'm sure all around the world this exists, but whenever a developer decides to develop something in your city, they have to put something into a fund called the Community Infrastructure Levy, or CIL. I think there's probably similar things all around the world. But we were able to access that money, which was just piling up in this separate budget in the council, to actually do things like buy benches in those parks and the red areas, put in litter bins, and actually change some of the maintenance schedule. Now, all of this was happening, but we haven't even talked about budgets. We haven't even talked about money. So this is what I'm really interested in, because I want to understand how local authorities make decisions about allocating resource to parks, and do they actually even know what is happening with their budget? So we're using the council as a case study, firstly because I work there, so I have access to data, but also Birmingham is the largest local authority in Western Europe, so we have lots and lots of data. Does anybody here want to guess how many green spaces we have in Birmingham? I haven't got a prize. David, you can't say anything. Want to give me a number? Go on, lady over there looking at you. I think you might want to give me a number. 52. 600. Thank you, Fergus. So yeah, we've got a lot of green spaces. And the one thing we also have in Birmingham is a really robust system which actually records the budget allocated to every single park over a 10-year period. Not many places have that in the United Kingdom. Luckily, we do. That's my study period. I've looked at this data for parks budget, and I'm only looking at grounds maintenance, and I know there are other budgets that support parks, but that is the only one that is consistent and comprehensive. If you compare it with the total BCC budget and other BCC budgets for other different services, it's quite an interesting story. So we've got two lines here. If we just look at the one that is purple for now, it shows this story, and this is a percentage change, so it's not an absolute number. But between 2013 and 2019, our grounds maintenance budget went down by about 15%. That's what's on our books, on our accountants' books in the council. But then you see it starts rising again to 2023, and you think that's a really positive story, okay? we lost money, but now we've made it back again. But the big problem is, and this is where local authorities do not think about economics in the same way that economists do, and I'm training in some extent to be an economist. That's quite loud, sorry. They haven't adjusted for inflation. And we all know in our daily lives, inflation is really important in terms of how we manage our budgets, how we manage our households, what the interest rate is on our mortgage. Inflation matters, and it should matter to local authorities as well. So what you see when you adjust for inflation, actually, by 2019, it goes down to nearly 25% reduction, and then it goes, and it doesn't make it anywhere near the figures that we were seeing in 2013. And that surprised my park service managers. They weren't aware it was as bad as that. Now, if you start to put in two other lines now, this blue line is the grounds maintenance budget. The one in purple is the total BCC budget. So again, we're just comparing percentage change here. The total BCC budget goes into billions and billions. The parks budget is in the small millions range. But what we're interested in is the shape of the graph here. So the total BCC budget keeps going down until 2020, but it starts to rise again and then goes down again slightly. And the red line, this is our social care budget. So budget for supporting children and adults who need, support and care. That follows a similar trend. It goes down and it goes up. But our parks budget doesn't look anything like other parts of the council. So there's further evidence here. Anecdotally, we know that parks budgets aren't treated the same as other bits of the local authority, but this makes that point really clear. Okay, this is a bit more complicated, this slide, so I'll take a little bit of time just to talk about this. So at the beginning of my presentation, I said that I was interested in budgets over a time frame, 2013, 2023. Now, I'm being a public health consultant, I'm really interested in deprivation and equality and equity. So Zena talked earlier about some of the issues that people living in more deprived parts of the city face in Bristol and Bath. And it's no different in Birmingham or any of our cities in the UK. So we can divide Birmingham up into these deprivation deciles. So there should be 10, but actually Birmingham doesn't really have very many affluent places. So IMD1 is the most, so this over here is the most deprived part of the city. And this is coming up to the most affluent part of the city. Now, in red, what you see there is what is the budget allocated to all those parks in those deprivation areas. And I've adjusted it for 100,000 people. Now, parks are not like hospitals or GP surgeries or libraries or leisure centres. There isn't an open door that you can measure people coming through, which is one of the biggest issues I think we have in terms of capturing benefit. So what David did was he basically mapped looking at every single park in Birmingham and estimating what is the population that is being served by that park. And from there, you can then start to compare like with like. But essentially what we're seeing is parks in the most deprived areas are probably getting about £10,000 per 100,000 population budget allocated. And that is vastly different, say, to some of our less deprived areas like IMD7, which is coming up to 40,000. What you'll also see is that if you look at the budget change between 2013 and 2023, the parks in the more deprived areas are seeing the biggest budget reductions. So every time there's, firstly, the percentage change in the parks budget is not the same as the rest of the council, so already there's an issue there. When the budget is allocated, it's not allocated in the same way to more deprived communities, and they then actually lose the most money as well. So from an equity perspective, this is really challenging. And again, the Park Service haven't seen the data cut in this way before. Now, what's really interesting as well, I think most people here are familiar with Green Flag. We're really proud to have, out of our kind of 437 parks that we've got, all the others are like allotments and cemeteries and school playing fields. We've got 15 that are Green Flag, so not very many. But to be a Green Flag park requires investment and good maintenance. Now, this is really interesting. So because we've only got 15 green flag parks, they don't serve a very big population, but they're actually getting allocated about £100,000 per 100,000 people compared to those parks without a green flag, which are getting about £15,000 allocated to them, 100,000 people. So again, being a green flag means that your park is allocated budget differently. Now that is not necessarily a bad thing, because I firmly believe that there are huge opportunities in our green flag parks that could be used to support, for instance, maintenance or raising revenue or maintenance in our other parks. But we're not having those kind of conversations yet. Similar to what our earlier presenters were talking about, this whole inertia and getting local authorities to think differently about doing things. It's quite a challenge. So, in terms of the grounds maintenance budget, well, I've shown that the budget's changed, it's gone down, but what actually is changing in our parks? So I've divided up the grounds maintenance budget into a number of areas, and we've divided them up into kind of aesthetics, grass cutting, cleanliness, sports pitches, tree management, hedges, playgrounds and toilets. And what I've tried to do is give you a sense of, over time, how those things changed. So if we look at this graph over here, just keep an eye on the time. So along the bottom, we've got time. So we've got 2013 to 14 all the way to 2023-24. And all these different axes, you'll notice that the scale is quite different because it just depends on how many times an activity is being done. So for instance, the kind of work that is done to provide an aesthetic look to a park was happening there was about 35 counts of that on average a year in 2013-14. That's gone down to nearly half at around 20. And you also see reductions in sports maintenance as well. And the other thing that you see a key reduction in is around the toilets and the amenities. And again, going back to one thing that Zina talked a lot about in her presentation as well, about some of the barriers to access, things like having amenities is really important for people to be able to use parks. But things like cleanliness, actually, and grass cutting, they haven't changed that much over the study period. But again, we've not looked at our data in this way before to see, well, actually, how is our budget being spent? Because often the budget is allocated in such a way that it's either historic. We did the same thing last year, so let's just do the same thing next year, but just do a little bit less of it. But I'm making an argument that actually by looking at this data and understanding it, you can make a bit more of an informed decision in terms of how you plan your budgets for parks. Okay, so in terms of park quality, this is something, when you look at the literature, there's a lot of research about what defines quality in a park, and it is really, really varied. But what I'm really interested in as part of my PhD is to say, do these budget cuts or do these budget changes, do they actually show us a measurable difference in quality? Now, again, parks are quite different. Most restaurants, most hotels, I think there was even a joke TripAdvisor for prisons at one stage, but you can actually rate, users can rate their experience of things like, hotels and restaurants and so forth. We don't quite have that for parks. We might get Google reviews, but they're not really consistent. So this whole idea about kind of, is it a quality park? You have to find other ways to kind of measure it. So park appearance, that's one element of quality. Antisocial behaviour is also a really important element of park quality as well. How people feel about the park, how safe it feels. And then there's also community engagement. That's the third pillar of park quality as well, which is measurable. So earlier I started off my presentation talking about how I set up a Friends of Park group in Birmingham, in my local park. We've got about 80 Friends of Park groups now in the city. But I can absolutely tell you that they're in the most affluent parts of the city and not in those red wards that I showed you. So, just in terms of how would you actually use data to build a quality index? So, we've got some local data in terms of how does the appearance of a park look, but that's all based on the budget data, unfortunately. We don't have kind of a separate measure, for instance, asking our local residents. I mean, Birmingham's got 1.2 million people living there. You know, if we could ask them all, what do you think of your local park? Do you think it looks clean? Do you think it looks tidy? That could be a useful measure, but we don't have it. In terms of antisocial behaviour, we have some data around kind of fly tipping. We've got reports of fly tipping and then removal of fly tipping. Just because it's reported doesn't mean it's always removed. We also have some reports of graffiti in parks that we can call on. And also, David and I have lost part of our souls trying to do some work around, can we analyse how much crime is reported within specific parks as well? So that data we now have. In terms of community engagement, we do have some data in terms of volunteering for parks. So we work with a charity called Birmingham Open Spaces Forum, and they, in order to be a part of that organisation as a volunteer group, you have to submit how many hours of volunteering you actually do per month. So we have some of that data as well. But there's still quite a lot more to do. Hopefully we'll have a break in a bit. If you want to grab me and maybe kind of have a conversation with me about any of these points. One thing I've said is that, you know, there is evidence that the park's grounds maintenance budget is being treated differently to the rest of the council. How do we get local authorities to take notice of this? Has anybody in the room got experience of doing this? If I was building a quality index for Birmingham, I've talked about some of the data that I've got access to. From your own experience, are there other data sources that you think I should be looking at? And also, what does this all mean in terms of regarding the value that funders give to parks? Because it all comes back to money. It all comes back to budgets. And in the world of economics, if you don't value something, then you're not going to be willing to pay for it. So this is the nub of my PhD. I haven't got to that question yet. So maybe next year I'll be able to come back and talk a bit more about that. Okay, it's not working again. Oh, there we go. I just wanted to say a big thank you to everybody that supports me on my PhD. So I've got my 3 supervisors, Emma, John, and Irina. Somebody in the council, Becky, my mentor, Chris, and also David is in the audience with me today. And if you want to connect with me, it'd be really great to have any more conversations. So thank you very much.